Thanks a lot for this great presentation from Celine, because I think this adds very well to the presentation that I will give, because I'll focus more on the organizational level, while Celine's presentation was a good insight into projects on the ground. And also, thanks a lot for the invitation. And it's really exciting to see that, as Holger already mentioned, the German development field is getting so actively engaged in the field of digital development. To give you some information about me, so I work with the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, and sorry for the long and complicated German name, a think tank in Berlin. And before that, I worked with Vodafone, where I worked for the Vodafone Foundation as well, and coordinated some projects on the ground, so in their African markets. And I also did consultancy work with governmental organizations in Latin America. And now I work at the think tank, rather looking at a policy perspective on digitization. So maybe just to give you an idea of where my thoughts come from. And at the foundation, at the think tank, we started a project last year, which is led by Géraldine de Bastion. Maybe some of you know her. And that project was on digital development and digital rights. And when we started this project, we asked ourselves, well, what is actually happening in other countries, and how are, for example, development organizations in the UK, in Sweden, in the US dealing with this issue? And so I did this research, and well, we actually wanted to look more into the issue of digital rights, but then we figured out that it's also very interesting to understand what are digital development strategies in general, so from an organizational level. And I'm going to share some of the findings with you. First, I just want to give you some, well, answer the question of why we have to look at that. Then second, I'll talk about the implications for development cooperation, and then so sort of the how, and then sort of the but. What are probably the implications of those applications of the way that we work on the ground, for example, with digital technologies. Well, what is happening at the moment, and a colleague from the Deutsche Welle just gave some really good insights about the work that the Deutsche Welle is doing right now on the digital transformation and how the Deutsche Welle is dealing with this issue, because what we see is that there is a paradigm shift. And I think this is really a change in development cooperation when we look back 15 years ago, for example. So in the 90s, BMZ already supported infrastructure projects, but they also did support in terms of a sectoral approach, so building up the technology sector, IT sector, and so on. And we've seen that in other development cooperations as well. But then we saw like slightly less interest in the last, well, I would say like the beginning of the century, and this is now changing, because what we realize is that actually our whole world has changed due to digitalization. And if we think about ourselves and the way we access information, the way we learn, the way we communicate, the way we do a transaction, the way we buy something, but also the way we interact, for example, with governments, or the way we want to interact with governments, the way we interact with the private sector and what we demand from the private sector, and to which extent, and this has also certainly a negative side, but to which extent we expect the private sector, for example, to know our needs and wishes. So this is all changing. And this is not only changing in Germany, but this is also changing globally. And while, of course, a lot of people do not yet have access to the internet, we see that connected devices like mobile phones are increasingly spread throughout the world, and we have also a sort of connected world that we're living in now. And we see that very vividly at the moment, because you're all very familiar with the refugee crisis at the moment that Europe is facing. There are more and more refugees coming to Europe, and Germany in particular, and a lot of people were surprised, well, these people have smartphones. Well, in the end, I think it's rather surprising that they are surprised, because, of course, while there's a complex set of reasons why so many people are coming to Europe right now, digital technology is also kind of a vehicle because it helps people to plan their travels, to stay in touch with people, their beloved ones at home, but also the people who left already, but also to get an idea and an understanding of the world that they are going to and the country that they want to move to. So this kind of global connectivity is certainly changing the world we live in. And as I said, in 2011, or I said earlier in the century, in development cooperation, the interest in ICT for development was rather low. And then in 2011, with the Arab Spring, we see that there is vast interest in the possibilities of using digital technologies to promote development, because development organizations, and especially in the media development field, understood that social media could be an important tool to promote goals in development. Today, in 2015, we also see the risks and challenges. So this is a screenshot from the gay dating platform Grindr from Egypt. And this is actually a warning to users of Grindr that they should be careful who they meet, because the Egyptian government is arresting people that use Grindr. So we see all these great potentials, but as always, technology is just not neutral. We also see the risks, and this is particularly a challenge for development cooperation, because it goes along with a huge responsibility. And then there are other developments where we're not sure yet whether they are risky or whether they are good. So this is actually a heading from this Monday, saying that Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, well, he's not mentioned here, but others, they have a plan to connect the world. And especially Mark Zuckerberg announced, or they pledged that they will connect refugee camps, which on the one hand is a great thing, but I think a lot of us also have this kind of rather skeptical feeling of what that might mean. So what we also see is that there is an increasing number of new actors getting engaged in this field, and also getting engaged in development. And this will certainly pose certain questions to development cooperation. So what does that mean for development corporations more on an organizational level? I think what has changed a lot is that we're moving from this projects approach that we've seen, because still, and we've seen that great example from Butterfly Work, ICT and digital technology can be used to improve projects in the education field, in the health sector. It allows, for example, to people speak up and support democratizational processes. But what we also see, and I think these are the questions that development corporations are starting to look at now, is that this is also changing, first of all, the internal processes, just like in any other organization, and especially governmental organization or ministry as well, but that it's also changing the way we collaborate and the way we interact with our stakeholders. And as I said, because there is a certain, the demand of, or the way we express our expectations and needs and demands has changed, and we're expecting something else, for example, from a government institution. So there are certain countries which are very proactive or progressive on these issues, and certainly there is USAID, so from the US, DFID from UK, and also CEDA, the Swedish development organization, who are very actively engaged in this debate for a while now. USAID has probably the most radical approach, I would say. So they just founded last year this development lab, which is kind of it's still within the structure of USAID, but it's like an external structure. And they want to move USAID towards a development enterprise. So of course, this is also driven by the whole debate about the Silicon Valley and startup approaches. And so they came up with this idea. Actually, the head of the lab is a former executive of Google. So we see how they are changing their approach. And still, of course, they have their regular and traditional work, but they have USAID, for example, they have people helping other people at USAID to become more digital literate, to use digital technologies. And they have this approach of incubation, acceleration, and scaling within their structures. So they are trying to be very fast with new ideas, test them. So what we just learned also from the design thinking approach, to also have that within their USAID projects that they release. Then we have DFID, and I really recommend you, so if you're interested in digital strategies for organizations, DFID, or generally, the UK is just a very, very interesting example, because they really do really a ton of work, and it's super transparent, and you can read all about the digital strategy of DFID on their blog. Also, what failed, what didn't fail, what works, where do they have to improve, and so on. And DFID uses digital technology specifically to make processes more efficient and to become more accessible and to become more outspoken about the work that they do. So as I said, they communicate about everything very transparently. And this, for instance, is one of the services that they developed in the course of this process, where they said, well, why is it still so complicated to get information about funding opportunities? And for external stakeholders or an NGO or Butterfly Works, I guess it's sometimes really difficult to understand how and why and where do they actually get money from a big donor organization like DFID. So they developed this really very easy to use tool where it's just a lot easier for people to engage with them. They are also trying to interact more with the people out there. So this is the the permanent secretary of DFID. He doesn't have too many followers yet, but still, they encouraged him to use Twitter and to become visible to the public. And this is probably not that important for the head of DFID, but this can be important, for example, for someone working on education in Kenya, because that moment when this person becomes visible to the stakeholders out there, and a lot of people in Kenya use Twitter, it's a lot easier for them to engage with them and to learn from their expertise, to exchange thoughts, and so on. Another thing that we see is that development organizations are becoming more and more transparent and open. So this is the platform of CEDA, showing their spendings, and probably some of you have heard about the IATI standard, which is the International Aid Transparency Initiative standard that helps development organizations to publish their data, but also NGOs and so on, so that it's a lot easier to understand, okay, where is money going to, which countries do what kind of money from which from which development organizations. And this platform from CEDA, I think it's really great because it's really easy to use, and it's, well, it makes it a lot easier for people also in Sweden to understand where their money is going to. But we also have other platforms, so the BMZ and also the KfW, for example, they have a transparency platform. DFID has a similar platform. And this one, for instance, is even open source, so it's easy to replicate. And then we see a growing trend towards innovation, similar to the work we just heard about from Butterfly Works. Development organizations are understanding that probably there are more innovative approaches out there, and that they don't have to do it all by themselves, but that maybe it's not only NGOs and like the typical stakeholders who are engaged in the development ecosystem, but maybe also a startup from Tel Aviv who will come up with a new great innovation on development and education, for instance. So they can apply for this Global Innovation Fund, which is a huge fund set up by DFID, USAID, CEDA, but also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I think there are other actors involved. And it's a lot easier now to apply for money, although you're not coming from the traditional development sector, because as Celine just mentioned, sometimes it's really hard to get funding if the organizations don't know you. So this is one tool to make it easier for innovation to happen outside. But there are other funding mechanisms. For example, CEDA also has a smaller fund where people can apply with very specific projects, for example, in the area of digital rights. You've probably already realized that there's more and more collaboration between development organizations, so especially the ones that I already mentioned several times, which are just very active in this field, so CEDA, DFID, USAID, but also others like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or UNICEF. And they developed these principles. They are also very much in line with approaches from design thinking and like user-centered design, so all these words that we are hearing at the moment quite a lot. And it's really based on, okay, what have we learned in the last 15 years in ICT for development, and how can we improve our projects? But also, how can we improve services internally? So how can we make sure that, for instance, the platform that I just introduced from DFID that helps you to find funding, that this is built in a way that it's usable for the people who actually need it. And I think I really recommend you to check this link because it's very helpful, because I know that a lot of people out there really want to apply these principles, but as soon as you look at your own projects, maybe you realize that you can improve on one or two of them still. And now just very briefly talking about the implications. So these were all great examples, and I mentioned, I mentioned several organizations quite often, and I think it's very encouraging what they do, but at the same time, what I think we're now realizing that maybe some of them have not really spent too much time thinking about the implications of their work, and if there are maybe negative impacts that could also rise from these projects. So this principle number 8, I think this is actually one that should be a bit more, we should spend some more time on, and is really relevant. There are organizations and also donor organizations like CEDA, but also actually the Netherlands, the foreign ministry, because they supported a lot of work, for example, from HIVOS and from other organizations working in the digital rights field. CEDA is organizing the Stockholm Internet Forum actually in 2 weeks from now, where they focus a lot on digital rights and freedom of expression, privacy, data protection. So we see that some of the organizations are already looking at this issue, but I think there can be more that could be done in this area. And here, for example, I see Germany playing an important role, because we have a very strong position on data protection, and I think this is actually something where the German development organizations could play an active role. And then we also have other organizations, so probably you heard about them, like Tactical Tech, who developed a toolbox for journalists to protect their privacy, to help them to move around safely in the digital space. And we have other organizations, for example, the Engine Room, which is a small NGO and that helps organizations to develop responsible data programs. And this is a best practice example from Oxfam, who jointly with the Engine Room developed their responsible program data policy. So I think these are all encouraging examples of how you can, on the one hand, ensure that you foster innovation and you make the best use of digital technology, but at the same time, you really try to safeguard digital rights. And so just last but not least, I have a slide with some more text. So just 5 issues that I would say I think are the most important, and that we have learned from looking at other donor organizations or development organizations. And the first one, and that's the easiest one, and I think a lot of you do that anyway, is to collaborate with partners that are already experts in the field. So I already mentioned Tactical Tech when it comes to helping journalists to develop, for example, good tools to protect their privacy, but also Butterfly works, for instance, when it's about design thinking approaches. So work with the ones who are already out there and who know how to come up with good ideas around digital development. Then seek advice. I think this is an interesting example also from DFID, because DFID, they have an external advisory board of people, I think it's about 8 people, who are experts in the area of ICT for development, and also from academia, NGOs, the private sector, and they help DFID, like they meet on I think once or twice a year, and then they talk about the digital strategy and help them to align the strategy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are existing standards and platforms and tools. The platform from CEDA and DFID, they are all open source. They can be used. The principles that were developed, they are very helpful. So there's a lot of things already out there if you want to get active in the digital development field, and you can use these things. And then the other thing is, when you think about your own structures and services and what you want to do, make sure that they are accessible and user-centered. So understand your products rather as a service than as a product, because you want to engage with stakeholders out there and make sure that the things that you do are actually helpful for your stakeholders. And then the third one is think digital and openly, but at the same time, think about the potential implications this could have. So I would usually go for open by default, but I would rather go for privacy by default. So think about privacy and then think about digital. And then leave room for innovation, because as we heard, it's really important to have processes that enable innovation, but at the same time, and thinking about the approach from USAID, I think it's also important to acknowledge that development is not a startup or like a tech startup from Silicon Valley, but it's complex, it takes time. We need innovative approaches, but we also need patience. And and the last one is, well, support your staff. And this is something that we see in USAID, in DFID, in CEDA, that digital development is really a leadership topic. So on the top level, this has been realized as an important priority. And I think this is very relevant to make your staff believe that they can actually test and explore things, and that they are not too afraid of the risks that this could have. And at the same time help them to get the right knowledge and capacities that they need to use digital tools. So just one last example from DFID, they also used a quiz, was kind of a training quiz where they asked all of the staff around the world to which extent they already work with digital tools, where they would need help, and so on. This is also available open source, so it can be used for any other organization. Yeah, I think it's a great approach to really help your employees as well to get interested in digital development. Yeah, thanks a lot.